G'day. Did you see what I just did? No, I don't mean putting more fuel in the tank. What I did was make a decision. You see, with 2/3 of a tank full, I figured I'd had enough fuel with reserve for today's flight. Big decision, eh? Yep, it was. But like all decisions that pilots make, it's one that I'm absolutely responsible for. No passing the buck. In fact, without realising it, I'd already made a number of decisions about today's flight. Now, the fuel was a biggie, but so was the decision to fly. When you fly, are you always conscious of the decisions that you make? Decisions. When do we make them, and how can we be sure they're the right ones? Keith McGregor is a psychologist who spent 12 years with the RNZAF. He has close links to the industry through his work with the Transport Accident Investigation Commission. Now, unlike most of us, he understands how we think, how the brain actually ticks. Now, Keith, when the Aircare team investigated the causes of general aviation accidents in New Zealand, the number one contributing factor that stood out by a country mile was poor decision-making. Now, of course, in the old days, it was mechanical failure that was the biggie. But now, the accident data seems to be telling us that it's mind failure that presents the big challenge. Does that surprise you?
Not at all, Jim. Apart from the fact that aircraft are now more reliable mechanically, three factors put decision-making way up there in the causes of accidents. First, flying requires lots of decisions, but the brain has a limit to how many it can properly deal with at once. Amazingly, a housefly actually processes spatial information much faster than the human brain. If you think about it, our brains were only designed for walking speed. So it's perhaps not surprising that they can get overloaded in flying environments. Second, on every flight, at least some features of the decision-making environment will be different. So we can't simply reuse decisions that were made in a similar situation on a previous flight and assume that they'll work well for us again on this flight. Third, emotions play a huge part in decision-making. Decisions are all about how it feels. The people who make most aeronautical decisions, pilots, often have personality characteristics that can work against good decision-making. Emotion also underpins the culture of organisations, and that culture can have a multiplying effect on the individual pilot's behaviour and emotions. Sure, we can't change who we are, but we can allow for it in our decision-making.
Now, I know we all learnt about decision-making at flying school, and were taught a few tricks of the trade, like aviate, navigate, communicate. And if you haven't experienced a flying accident, you may well feel that you are already on top of this decision-making business. However, people involved in air accidents no doubt thought this too, at least before they happened. We have to learn to improve our decision-making even just a little bit. By the way, check out this symbol and remember it. Each time you see it, double check the way you're making decisions. It'll keep you alive. Now, Keith, back to those three things you mentioned. Overloading the brain, the constantly changing environment of each flight, and personality and work culture. Now, you mentioned these were behind all poor decision making. So how do we understand them and what do we do about it?
Okay, the brain has two main parts. The subconscious mind processes over 100 million signals a second, but the conscious mind, the bit we use to maintain situational awareness and make flying decisions, is only processing 1 or 2 pieces of information at a time. Now, the obvious and easiest way to reduce overload is to spread out the decision making. How? By making as many decisions about your flight as possible before you leave the ground, or before you're at the point of actually having to use the decision. Now, this helps if the unexpected arises, like those clouds you were hoping to fly under being lower than you expected, or trickier still, if problems occur during takeoff. The key is to ensure that the brain already has a stored decision because you thought about that possibility during your pre-flight risk assessment and does not become cluttered with other right now decisions.
John Fogden is the manager of Rotary Wing and Agricultural Operations, New Zealand's Civil Aviation Authority. He's also an experienced helicopter pilot. Well, John, it sounds pretty simple, this idea of spreading out the decision making.
Jim, the reason I'm here today is because I quickly learnt to make that one of my rules, to spread out the decision making. I learnt early in my career there's a big difference between flying an aircraft and being a truly aviation professional. And a professional pilot is one that doesn't have to prove himself in the air. I do a lot of my work by making a lot of the decisions before I even get anywhere near the aircraft.
What about this business of improving the processing speed of the brain? Can you really do that?
Sure. There are 3 parts to it. First is not to slow the brain down by being tired, hypoxic, drug or alcohol impaired, or stressed. I mean, it might sound obvious, but it's often overlooked and hard to acknowledge. Second is to understand stress and how to manage it. Third, as well as making as many decisions as possible before they'll be needed, you can pre-program your brain with techniques that make decision-making in the air easier, faster and safer.
But don't the regulations deal with tiredness and alcohol?
Yes, of course they do, Jim. But some pilots push the boundaries and forget that things like drinking coffee don't change the rate at which the body breaks down alcohol, nor is it a substitute for sleep. Furthermore, tiredness persists even after you wake up. Incredibly, for most people, decision-making performance will still be 20% below normal 30 minutes after they wake up. This is important for on-call pilots. How stress works is something every pilot needs to understand because it causes us to tense up, to breathe faster, heat up, then start sweating to try to cool down, and scarily, it switches off the thinking part of our brain as it prepares us to fight, flee or freeze. You can mentally picture your internal stress meter progressively changing from green to yellow, but if it redlines, you certainly can't rely on your brain at that point to be a good problem solver. That's why some pilots adopt a firm 3 strikes abort rule.
Andy Stevenson is an experienced ag operator based in Gisborne. In a single day, he can make over 100 takeoffs and landings, mostly from farm strips. What about the 3 strikes rule that people talk about?
Oh yeah, I think that's good. I think if you got up to 2 strikes, you should be wondering about yourself because we're talking about the same day. So 2 strikes is plenty. But what I do is I always keep plenty up my sleeve, so I never go to the limit anyway. And you might see my aeroplane doing turns and stuff, but there's always a huge margin left, and that is setting my limits and being cautious.
Russell Baker is the CEO for Air Fiordland, and he's been flying fixed wings for years.
Well, I use a 4-strike rule, and one of those is Lady Luck, and we can never rely on her. She can go away on us at any time. So if we have failing light, we have bad weather, and we are low in fuel, we're getting them all lining up together, and you're gone. Even with good training and good maintenance, pilots have got to recognise the fact that the unexpected can come out and bite them at any time.
It's not the actual event that gives rise to stress. It's what we say to ourselves inside our head about the event or situation which triggers the stress response. So by being aware of the self-talk, we can often shut down the stress response before it gets out of control. Stress also comes in different forms. In flight, it can occur if there is a sudden increase in decision-making demands. For example, an engine failure on takeoff, unexpected traffic, loss of situational awareness, or, as can sometimes happen, several simultaneous problems. Anxiety builds and decision-making becomes harder and less accurate. But there are also background stresses of life. Things like mortgages, bills, family issues, commercial challenges. Unmanaged, they can start mopping up our capacity to process information. A useful double check for a pilot walking towards their aircraft is to ask themselves whether they are taking along any unseen passengers. By that I mean mental baggage. If those passengers aren't on the manifest, go back and get rid of them.
Well, John, you're probably like the rest of us and have to deal with financial worries, sick kids and day-to-day hassles. How do you stop all this mental baggage from travelling along with you?
I use a mental trick before I go flying. In the same way that I check everything that's in the flight bag that I need, I consciously identify the issues I don't need during the flight. Any issues that I can't solve before I go, I'll leave them in a mental box on the ground and they stay there until I get back. And as far as distractions are concerned, that cell phone, before a pre-flight and before planning your flight, turn that cell phone off and leave it in your bag.
ACAT instructor Peter Kidd from Hastings has more than 15,000 flying hours behind him, so he speaks from experience. So as an instructor, Peter, how do you get students to take a disciplined approach to pre-flight decision making?
Well, that's a critical one, Jim. We teach them to plan for any foreseeable emergencies identified in the pre-flight risk assessment. What we actually do is use a formal pre-line-up review of the takeoff plan, aids and radio setup, and emergency, such as an engine failure on takeoff. The review is based on conditions of the day, involves the use of touch checks, increases the residual mental capacity of the pilot, and thus improves his decision-making. For example, on a twin, if the failure occurs before V1, the pilot plans to abort the takeoff and apply maximum braking to achieve a safe stop. For failure after V2, he plans to fly away at a single-engine climb gradient in accordance with the pre-line-up review for the current conditions of the day. It's worth noting, Jim, that after qualifying, pilots not committed to being professional in all that they do will often let these practices slip in the privacy of the cockpit. And who are they kidding with that decision? Only themselves.
So let's summarise the brain workload issue so far. Make as many decisions as possible before even getting in the aircraft, and make sure the old brain is match fit. But Keith, what's this business about pre-programming the brain with a decision-making process?
Yes, that helps a lot when things suddenly change or go wrong. There are two issues really. One is to do things in the most appropriate order.
Like aviate, navigate, communicate.
Exactly. It's helpful to adopt a process for decision making that you always follow, but it needs to become instinctive because it will free up your decision making capacity. Top sports people do this. They mentally rehearse their game or plays. The main thing is to recognise that decision making is all about making a choice. These choices might need to be considered quickly, but you have to be disciplined. Otherwise, it might be a case of QDD, quick, decisive, and dead. There are some good decision-making processes that are taught in aviation circles and use acronyms such as SPORDEC and SAIDI. They work well, so if that's what you've learned, stick with them. The main thing is to train your brain to follow a standard procedure. First, understand your situation, and particularly what has changed. Consider in turn the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and the operation. If you don't think about all four areas, you can be making a splendid decision about one while ignoring a much larger issue just because it wasn't obvious. Then identify your options and rate them. Make your decision by choosing the best option, then implement it. Keep monitoring and reviewing both your situation and your options, and check that the option that you selected is still working well.
That can be difficult sometimes.
Yes, it can, particularly if making a change means giving away some perceived gain. For example, if the weather has changed, but after evaluating your options you decided to press on, it will be hard to turn back if things get even worse. Some pilots describe this as got to get there-itis. In the air, with your objective in sight, you can find yourself recalibrating and accepting risks that in the calm environment before takeoff you had judged to be too risky. That's why it makes sense to pre-program your brain with some firm rules that you just never break.
Hamilton-based rescue helicopter pilot Sue Dinkelacker has had first-hand experience of instant decision-making. Now, Sue, you had to make some pretty quick decisions back in January 2003 when your rescue helicopter en route Wellington to Masterton Hospital hit a tree in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I sure did. I was making a late-night VFR flight with a doctor and nurse using our regular route to cross the Tyrannikau Pass. It was fairly zigzag, so I was following a standard route programmed into the GPS. I was below the cloud base. I could see the ground and the lights on the other side of the ridge. But I missed one turn in the pass and lost my visual reference. My options suddenly became poor. Either continue, or attempt to turn in the narrow pass, or go IMC and climb into the cloud. I hadn't held an instrument rating for a long time, so these were all poor options. I chose the latter, to climb into cloud, when suddenly my radio altimeter wound down from 250 feet. Moments before, I'd had 1,000 feet below me. My aircraft hit a dead tree. I saw the floor munch up right to my feet. The windshield shattered. The one skid and radio antennas were smashed. I was still flying, but I was still in the cloud. The aircraft had slewed around 180 degrees and was down to 14 knots.
Now, you all survived that night because of your airmanship. You kept the helicopter hovering for 90 minutes while the damaged skid was cut off, and then you made a safe landing on a bed of tyres. Now, looking back, what have you taken from that incident that other pilots can learn from?
Well, pilots need to make some rules for themselves that they don't ever breach. It's my personal rule now, when flying VFR at night, not to go below the IFR minimum safe altitude, even in VMC. And there are two other things as well. One is not to be over-reliant on the GPS. Once you've flown past a waypoint, the display may not show you the way back. And the other really important one is to pre-plan for finding yourself in inadvertent IMC.
Now, Keith, the situation can change during a flight, of course. So how do we deal with the mind's reluctance to change a decision already made?
Well, that's the issue of being a professional pilot, Jim. Professional pilot knows that they're accountable. They always want to make the best choice, even when they're alone without a co-pilot to challenge them. That includes being willing to cut their losses and also developing a mindset that says best idea wins, not last idea. And a professional pilot is never embarrassed to ask for help.
That's the big one.
Any pilot who becomes unsure of their position can ask for assistance, whether they're on a flight plan or not. Pilots should prepare their minds to do this, and most importantly, prepare their minds to do it sooner rather than later. All that is needed is a simple message to the nearest control tower or to Christchurch Information. Just give the call sign, the altitude, approximate location, and ask for assistance. Any controller or flight service officer hearing that message will do all they can to help the pilot. It also helps us to consider the needs of other traffic in the vicinity. In an emergency, if the pilot is in radar coverage and squawks 7700, a signal will flash on the radar screen of every controller in the country, and you will be helped.
AIA President and experienced rescue pilot John Fennell from Taupo, well, he's seen a lot in over 40 years of flying. Well, as we know, John, aviation's a constantly changing world. What about the role of recent advances in technology when it comes to decision making?
Well, everyone knows that technology helps, but only if it's used. For example, the recent advances in GPS terrain information displays help the pilot with navigation and situational awareness. Related to this, the EGPWS, or Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, will give the pilot both visual and audible warning of hazardous terrain.
Warning, terrain. Warning, terrain.
The cost of technology is continually reducing, and this is another reason, Jim, for pilots and operators not to wait until its use is legislated. In the end, it's the pilot and the operator who are responsible for safe decision making, not the regulator.
So let me recap. You say there are three big challenges to decision making. Number one, there are challenges on the brain's capacity to make decisions. Number two, every flight occurs in a different environment, so you can't just reuse previous decisions. But what about this third one, emotions and personality?
By nature, pilots are very task-oriented. Once there is a goal, the brain starts to focus on achieving that goal. Other issues can move into the periphery. But if it's a wrong goal, like trying to communicate, the more critical goal of aviating can get forgotten.
Now, sir, you said your mistake was flying in conditions that did not allow you to maintain the IFR minimum safe altitude, even though you were quite legal flying VMC.
Exactly. It's hard to admit an error en route or change a decision already made. The pilot's number one responsibility is not the plight of the person awaiting rescue, or the passenger's expectation of a great view, or the tandem jumper's hunger for an adrenaline rush. The pilot's primary responsibility is for the safety of the flight. And it's really important that the organizations behind those operations build and maintain that safety culture.
Is it a good idea, do you think, to critique a successful flight as well as one that has had problems?
Absolutely. That way you can learn from every decision, the ones that worked well and the ones that could have been improved.
So the issue for pilots when we make decisions is not just how to do something. We need to ask ourselves, should I be doing it at all?
Yes, and if you're a single aircraft operator working alone, it's an even bigger challenge. But you're still a professional pilot, and only you are responsible for your decision making.
So let's recap. Good decision making involves several factors. Teach yourself to recognise a decision when you make it and your accountability for it. Be nice to your brain, give it a rest. Unload the baggage and don't slow it down with residual alcohol, for example. Don't overload it. Make as many decisions as possible before the flight, and after the flight, check back that you did. Prepare your brain for the unexpected by visualising yourself dealing with it. And picture yourself asking for assistance early if you become concerned. Stick to the priorities. Aviate, navigate, communicate. If you don't have a standard decision-making process, develop one that automatically considers the situation, then the options, evaluates the risks, selects the best option, but then keeps it under review. Have standard abort rules. That way, you won't start persuading yourself that something that was too risky on the ground has somehow become okay in the air. And take a good look at yourself, and even harder if you're a bloke. If you're a strongly goal-oriented, can-do type of person, you need to train your brain to override those instincts and emotions, because when the chips are down, they will get you into trouble. Technology can make flying easier, so use it. But don't let it trap you into making decisions that you wouldn't otherwise make. Take a look at the organisation you work for and its culture. If the firm's culture isn't supporting good decision-making, show the boss this program. Finally, the buck stops with you. By law, pilots are responsible for their decisions. Standing at an inquiry, giving evidence under oath, could you really claim your decision was the best of the options open to you? And remember this, when you're making decisions, be risk aware and double check. It'll keep you alive.